Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining our webinar today. And if you're watching this on replay, thank you so much for your interest. Teams has become pervasive in the modern day work culture, and many enterprises are struggling to keep up with the performance demands of Microsoft Teams. In today's session, I hope to shed some light on the different aspects and characteristics of Microsoft Teams when it comes to performance, especially when it comes to AVD. My name is Blair Parkhill. I'm a digital nomad and a remote work enthusiast. I work for Login VSI, and I've been here for quite some time, about 7 years. I do find myself working from different locations around the world, but most commonly between Colorado, even Costa Rica, and most recently, New Mexico, where I now have a new home and a new office, and it's a great place to be able to work from, and very beautiful location as are the rest of the places that I get to visit around the world. As much as I love geeking out on Azure and Microsoft Teams, this session is not just about the tech behind the solution. It's about how much it costs to run and how to manage these costs, especially when operating in the cloud. When I discover things that can help my friends out there who are managing their own VDI and thinking about how to optimize the cost of their solutions, I want to help. This session is to highlight performance behaviors of Microsoft Teams so that your org can better understand, plan, or manage these costs. I mean, Teams is resource hungry and changes often because real-time collaboration is worth it. We have customers impacted by Teams performance looking for solutions today. Optimizing the cost out of a solution, especially OpEx, will be an increasing trend and skill. Now, some performance considerations when using Teams on VDI. Just like any applications, Teams will consume system resources, and those system resources cost money. And this is compounded even more by the fact that we're running in VDI, which means you have multiple Teams instances running on a single host. There are several factors that can change the performance of this profile, however. So the Teams client that's being used, is this locally installed on a VDI client or locally installed on a laptop? Is it installed on a session host, in which case we'd recommend using a per machine MSI style installation, which invokes a lot of optimizations. Or you can go to teams.microsoft.com and use the web browser version of Teams. But understand that which client that you choose to use will have an impact on the performance of Teams. The remoting client also comes into consideration here when we're considering performance. So Citrix, VMware, and Microsoft all have remoting clients that do enable some of these optimizations if you're using the latest and the greatest clients. For example, MSRDC, that's the red circle you see here, that's Microsoft Remote Desktop Client, and that's the one we use for AVD. This is not the old remote desktop connection that you used to have ages ago in Windows 10 and even Windows 11. But these remoting clients do either enable or disable optimizations that you can take advantage of. One example of a connection that disables optimizations would be RD Web, or when you access your Azure Virtual Desktop Workspace through the Chrome or Edge browser, for example. So you got to be careful of those things. Also, how is Teams started on the session host? Is it automatically started for every user so that when they log in, Teams instantly pops up? Or is it configured to manually start whenever the user needs to use Teams? There are some benefits and drawbacks to either. And then lastly, media offloading. This is the optimizations that are behind the core performance benefits that we get from having these pieces in place. And that media offloading really just looks at audio and video and how it can route that audio video in the most efficient way so that you get great quality, but not so much system utilization that could limit the number of users per session host. Some of the vendors out there do have some good guidance, at least to start with. Citrix, on one hand, has some information here about using Teams in a Citrix environment. And you can see there's quite an impact from what they document here. You can see scalability is impacted, CPU utilization, memory, storage, all of this stuff is impacted by using Teams. And again, as I mentioned earlier, it's a collaboration tool. It's worth it. I mean, you gotta spend these kind of resources to enable this kind of technology. But while they have some general guidance for us, it's great to have, but how do I know which kind of environment this applies to? Because as we'll see, there are multiple configurations for Teams that can enable and disable this type of performance hit, but also give us a little bit of a benefit and relieve some of that hit by having things configured the right way. So Teams performance really depends on the workload and the configuration. I know of quite a few who have underestimated the impact of Teams. And I can tell you right now, there are two applications that I see on workspaces today that can eat up a lot of system utilization and cost. And that's web browsers like Chrome and Edge and Teams. So I even see this in comparison to the Office suite, where the Office suite doesn't even take up as much resource as Edge and Teams might in a workspace. So important to note that. And in my last webinar during our Login VSI Vision event, I did present some information around Teams and the impact of adding Teams to a knowledge worker workload. And that information that I shared was for chat and screen share meetings on an optimized client. Now, I feel this is going to become part of our vernacular now. We have to be able to differentiate whether or not we're using screen sharing or camera or just collaboration. We have to understand if we're using an optimized client or not, because all these things contribute to the overall performance footprint of Teams. So looking back at some of the data I presented during our Vision event, a month or so ago, you could see that when we added Teams to our D16DS v4 machine instance that we used for our Azure Virtual Desktop Session Host, that without Teams we had a pretty good score, an end user experience score of 7.2. And when we added Teams and more resources were drawn, obviously that end user experience score dropped because the system was getting pushed a little harder. And in the graph to the right, you can see the line underneath the bottom line. You can see the dips when Teams was being used, which effectively causes that score to be lower. And you can see the CPU utilization is also quite a bit higher. We go from 58% to 77%. Memory as well. So you can see at 33% CPU increase and 20% memory increase, it's pretty consistent with the numbers we saw on the last slide for Citrix guidance. So now that we have taken a look at that and understand that on a D16 DSv4, what happens when we kind of upgrade to a new machine instance that has more power to it? Well, I find that the D16DS v4 versus the v5 comparison really plays out quite nicely here, especially when we talk about cost. So in the table, you can see the EUX score with no Teams. And with no Teams, we can see that 24 users on this v4 running the knowledge worker, we get an end user experience score of 6.7. CPU utilization is a bit high, around 70%, and memory around 62. Now, what happens when we take that v4 session host and we upgrade that to a v5? Well, first of all, you can see with more system resources, because of this next generation processing platform, the end user experience score is obviously higher. But even when we include Teams with the knowledge worker, it's still higher, which is great news. About 9% performance improvement from an end user experience perspective. CPU, when we looked at that during steady state, that's what this SS means, we can see that the CPU utilization was down. That's great. That means there might be more overhead for more users to put on the system, which has a good correlation to cost. And memory utilization still increased because we're running Teams here. So that's understood. So now let's just take a quick peek at cost, because when I pulled the numbers for these two instance types, they both came out to be about the same price per month, which is good news, right? I know that on that v4 instance, if I were to add Teams, I would have to go from 24 to about 16 users. That would make my dollar per user per month to include Teams about $41 per user per month. take the same cost for a V5 and you're running 24 users on that host with Teams at an even better user experience, and you're looking at $27 per user per month, right? What a drop in the cost of the solution simply by knowing that going to a V5, I can increase my efficiency and provide Teams utilization. This is all really cool stuff. Keep in mind too, this is for an optimized environment, an optimized client, running Knowledge Worker and Teams. So really cool stuff. Now, I've mentioned optimizations a bunch, and by optimizations, I mean media optimizations. And let's just take a little bit closer look at what I mean by optimization. Now, first of all, the big chunk of what these optimizations are is in offloading. So I'm basically offloading the media handling from the session host directly to the client. And that's enabled through a technology called WebRTC, or real-time communications. It's a peer-to-peer technology, and I'll show you a graphic of that on the next slide at what that really means. But offloading is just a huge advancement in technology that enables a much better cost ratio on these types of solutions in AVD. Now, if Teams is not media optimized, it will fall back to a non-optimized mode. And when Teams starts, it checks to see what kind of mode should it run in. That's one thing that we'll also take a look here in a little bit. Now, the more you rely on the session host to do that processing for you in this fallback mode, the more of a performance impact Teams is going to have on that session host, obviously. Not only is the session host going to be busier, but the latency involved, the number of network hops that you'll have to make between you and the peer that you're communicating with is definitely going to increase, right? More hops, more latency, and therefore potentially more problems, which is definitely not a good thing. So again, another reason to better understand this. So let's just take a quick peek at WebRTC. This WebRTC enables us again to kind of deal with more peer-to-peer audio and video communications. So if we're non-optimized, that means the user on the left is going to be sending some kind of audio video to the user on the right. Well, non-optimized means that I'm going through the session host, and that means that session host is going to have to process video and audio cycles, and it's definitely going to have an impact, which we'll see here in a little bit. So that's the non-optimized mode. If we look at WebRTC and the optimizations in Teams, what that enables us to do is have a peer-to-peer channel where audio and video feeds are sent directly from one peer to another and not having to go through the session host. And clearly you can see the benefits that would happen because of that. Fewer network hops, better video and audio quality, fewer problems for your end users, and better scalability of your environment all around. So WebRTC is definitely a cool technology that enables a better cost profile. So if you want to learn a little more, I do have some links in there that you can grab either from the PDF that we give you access to, or just kind of type that in and go find out more. It's pretty cool. Now, not only does performance change as you enable optimized modes with Teams, but you also get more features. Again, another reason to really shoot for trying to operate in an optimized environment. And I understand if you can't put all the pieces in place either for security reasons or other things, but I still need to impress upon you the fact that optimizations really does carry a huge cost benefit. So some of these features which help with end user experience are the new meeting experience, where you can have kind of your meeting experience pop out away from your normal collaboration experience in Teams, where you have two different windows. Local device enumeration, meaning if I'm using the optimized mode, then there's a good chance that I have access to the devices that I'm using from the client that I'm sitting in front of, like camera and microphone. Background effects are important. Blur, for example, so people can't see what's behind you, and pay more attention on the speaker. Things like that are also really important and only come with things like optimized mode. Now, if you're not optimized, you can still get the best out of chat, collaboration, presence, am I here, am I not here, am I away? That kind of stuff it all works about the same. So no big hit there. And if you want to learn a little more about what kind of features that you get with certain optimizations, check out this link. It's a good one by Microsoft, and I think it explains a lot of the things that you might be curious about. So how do I know if Teams is media optimized? I put everything in place, but I want to verify that. Well, when you open the Teams user interface, you can go to the settings menu that's by your user avatar. You click on the three dots and you can find About Teams. You click About Teams, and then when you select version, it will put the version here in this banner on top of your client. You can see on the banner that it says AVD Media Optimized, and you can also see that Microsoft has given us some information about the client, the Microsoft remote desktop client that you use if you want to enable some of these optimizations. So that's one way to find out. If we're using, the remote desktop client with AVD, you can see it's either optimized or not connected, along with the version here. If you're using Citrix as another example, you can see Citrix HDX optimized versus not connected, right? Optimized versus not optimized. This gives you pretty good clarity into, the solutions your end users are going to be able to take advantage of, okay? So that's just a quick and dirty on optimizations. Now, as an engineer here at Login VSI, I'm using our own product, Login Enterprise, to understand how Teams behaves, because Teams is really dependent on how users are using it. And it's very difficult to get maybe 100 users to jump on Teams and hey, do a call now. But when you do a call, use your camera or use screen share or, mute your microphone. All of these things are things that the virtual users can do over and over again, which makes it really easy for me to learn how Teams works in my environment. The same is applicable to you. If you use Login Enterprise in your environment, there's a lot to learn about the benefits that you can take advantage of and tune. So let's look at my test environment. I'm operating in Azure and with an AVD infrastructure. I have a session host that's running on this D16DS v5. And that session host has FS Logics running. All my users are logging in here. I have Teams as an MSI install version for all users. So everything is set up there on the session host in Azure, and that's all pretty straightforward and things that you could do in Azure with AVD. Now, to get Login Enterprise running, I'm going to download the virtual appliance and I'm going to install it into Microsoft Azure, and you can have that virtual appliance available to you anywhere around the world. It takes about 30 minutes to get it up and running, and once you have it running, then you can start to deploy some of your launchers. These launchers can be Windows 10 VMs running the launcher software. They'll also be running the remote desktop client, so that we can take advantage of being able to run an optimized test versus a non-optimized test. So that's our launcher. And the last thing I added was my own laptop. I want to be able to use my laptop that has a full client for Teams installed to present slides, present a video playback, or even present my camera. So using my remote laptop in this case really helps to display those things and really get this test, looking at the things that I wanted to discover. So not only is it the test environment that I need to set up and test in, but it's also the user that's very important to me, because I don't just want to test Teams by itself. I want to test it with the things that my users are actually using. So with Login Enterprise, we have what's called the Microsoft 365 Knowledge Worker. This Knowledge Worker uses all of the Microsoft Office suite, Edge, Outlook, Excel, Word, PowerPoint, and what it does is it cycles through each of these applications during the workload, so that you have many concurrent users that are all using the Knowledge Worker profile and the Knowledge Worker tools like Microsoft Office. So what I did in my testing was I just added the Microsoft Teams user or Teams workflow to this workload, which allows me and this virtual user to chat with other virtual users, and it also causes this virtual user to join the meeting that I have set up and already running, and they will join for about 10 minutes. In my previous research, I only had those users join for about a minute, and what I found was the longer those users joined and the more concurrent they happened to be on, that's when I really saw the pressure on the session host. And that's when I really learned a lot of the valuable data we're about to see. So let's just jump into what it looks like from a session host perspective. I want to see what the impact is as a session host deals or does not deal with the audio video media. So we'll take a first look at an optimized system where we're doing audio and screen sharing. So in this case, you can see on my launcher system here on the right-hand side, any place where you see a lot of these little blue squares, that's just a playback MP4 video that I'm running on my laptop that all the users are connecting to and watching. The screen does not have a whole lot of refreshing areas on the screen. You know, one of these blue boxes will flicker. They'll have a little pop-up come up, you know. So you see this little white dot kind of move around a little bit. So there's not a lot of change on the screen itself, but it is being presented. It is you know, transmitting graphics and things like that. So with 24 users on this D16 Azure instance, you could see that the end user experience score was really good, just like we saw in the data that I presented at our Vision event. We got a great user experience score, 7.8, again, really good. And the CPU and memory utilization during the Teams part of the workload, still not too high. That means that we can actually fit more users on the system outside of just 24 users if my users are going to be doing just screen sharing and not any camera feeds or anything like that. So speaking of camera feeds, let's take a look at how that might be a little bit different. So looking at Teams collaboration using audio and camera, obviously with a camera, you're going to have a much more frequent refresh rate. So, you know, anywhere between 16 and 30 frames per second, maybe. And when you have a screen refresh rate of that much, obviously that's going to put a lot of work into Teams to have to, you know, encode, decode, or just play back a lot of that video or you know, transmit that video. In this case, using an optimized system where I'm doing peer-to-peer, we could see that the CPU utilization is still quite low. Memory utilization is about the same, you know, with this 24 users. So things, again, look like, you know, if I'm using optimized mode, I could probably get more than 24 users on the session host, especially during peak times when Teams is being used. So that's all really good information. It does also show you kind of, you know, how a system looks when it's running optimized. Let's take a look at what it looks like when it's not optimized, because I think that's where things get interesting. What I did here was I used the service Remote Desktop Services WebRTC Redirector. By default, this service is on, and this is what allows my users to have that peer-to-peer WebRTC communication and offload the session host. So what I did was I disabled that service. And when I disabled that service and restarted Teams on the client, you could see that Microsoft Teams is not AVD media optimized like it was before. So I know I'm kind of working with a non-optimized system here. So now that I've got the session host in a non-optimized state and all the Teams instances, you can see that things do look a bit different. I'm running the same video. I'm running 3 launchers here, 24 sessions, and we can see that in a non-optimized mode, we are putting a little more burden on the CPU. The memory utilization doesn't really change, but you can see we go from 42% to 57% with a screen share that doesn't have a whole lot of change on it, again, like PowerPoint slides or something like that. We're starting to encroach into the area we have, you know, for adding more users or some spare capacity, and I get, you know, it hits a little more at the cost of the solution, you know, when I can't put as many users on there. So I am in a non-optimized mode, getting it to a point where things aren't looking that good, and optimized versus non-optimized, I'm still keeping it up there in the 7.5 plus range, which is really good in terms of the performance and the end user experience. Okay, so let's look at what things look like when I'm adding the camera now versus just a screen share. Obviously with a camera, I'm going to be using more resources because my frame cycles are going to be refreshing quite often. My full screen perspective, that's going to be changing, things like that. And so we can see here that we start to get into really big trouble when we go from optimized to a non-optimized and we're sharing a camera with multiple participants. You can see we got to 100% CPU utilization on the session host, which is quite an issue. I did notice that right at about between 6 to 9 sessions on the session host is when I started hitting 100%. So this is before we even get to 24 users using their receiving the camera feed, right? So my session host density has pretty much been cut in half, from actually even more than that. Going from 24 users to about 6 to 9 users is a major hit on the scalability of the session host as well as the cost. So I can see why a lot of my customers are getting into issues with their team solutions because of not being able to use optimized mode, or because they just haven't figured out how to turn that on yet. So this really shows the big difference between using your cameras in non-optimized mode and optimized mode. Now, the user experience is also going to be severely impacted. You can see in the graph on the top, we have optimized mode where we are just really giving a great user experience. I think we're about 7.8 or an 8.0 on that experience, which is just almost the best you can get. But as soon as you kind of dip into this non-optimized territory, you can see as we're running teams, that just drops off heavily. And again, that's going to impact our scalability for this solution. So this is really the big takeaway here, and something that I'd like to impress on you. Now, if you're not running in optimized mode and you're allowing your users to use cameras, or you're sharing screen content that has a lot of areas that refresh on the screen, then this is something that you're going to have to pay attention to. You could see some very wide variability in your session scalability, so you're going to get quite a few users that could be complaining about their user experience that could be rather challenging. So this was a really cool finding that I was able to find in my testing, something certainly I would encourage you to test in your environments to discover, what does that look like for my users? And are there things I can use to enable or disable the ability to, do calls with video and things like that? There's plenty of Microsoft information out there that you might want to discover to help sculpt the performance profile of your team's implementations. Now, there's one more thing too that I looked at. Of course, logging into a session host is something that is a very important part of the user experience. And because Teams adds or contributes to the system resource utilization during logon, because as soon as I log on, Teams is the first application to start up, obviously there's going to be an augmented performance penalty to that. So what I did was just a quick test where I started, I let the virtual user start Teams manually. So basically this is a login cycle, a login storm without Teams, and then this would be a login storm with Teams, right, where Teams is adding to that pressure on the session host. Here in the table, you can see that on average, we're looking at about a 15% utilization during logins versus an 8% where we're not including Teams as a part of that startup experience. Now, this can be beneficial to know for two reasons. Number one, if I'm working in a culture where I have a lot of users logging in at the same time and getting right to work, I might not be able to, or I might not want Teams starting up automatically because I want to get those users logged in. I want that to be a good user experience, and I need to preserve some of that system resource to enable that. And that could be if I'm going from anything less than a 30-second login interval per session host. So user 1 logs in, waits 30 seconds, user 2 logs in. If I want to compress that, then this may be something I want to invoke. Right. So a lot of cool things that we learn about Teams, and when you test something like Teams, it definitely will show you how it behaves, which gives you an opportunity to kind of take things into your own hands around how you use Teams in your environment and configure it. Now, all of this are pretty quick insights. I spent a day or two just sniffing around Teams, performing some tests, and was able to really capture a lot of very interesting insights here. So while they're interesting and while we learned a little bit here, it doesn't necessarily transmit to how this will directly affect you. You're going to have to do your own testing and figure out what that performance profile looks like for you in your environment for your organization. But here are some key insights that I think will really help you navigate where to look in terms of those optimizations. And then I also believe that, in the tests that I did with screen sharing and where I didn't have a lot of refreshing cycles, things like that on the screen, a lot of busyness happening on the screen, if I were to add more busyness and a lot more areas of the screen that are refreshing, then I might see a higher CPU utilization on the session host. So, it might not be so much about screen sharing versus camera. It just might be about how much of that screen is changing or expected to change. And that could certainly drive a lot of performance. Now, how your organization collaborates matters, right? As I mentioned earlier, if I don't need the camera, if it's not business critical, and I really want to squeeze the most out of my session hosts, perhaps disabling the ability to make calls with cameras is one of those things you want to do, because you're not able to, take advantage of some of the optimizations through WebRTC and things like that. So that's one thing to definitely pay attention to. Just because they're there doesn't mean you have to use them. And, as we saw, optimization is a big deal. So figure out how you can take advantage of it if possible. As I mentioned earlier, there could be some security things that keep you from enabling optimizations. I don't really have those offhand on what those are. I just know that some of our customers are unable to use some of these optimizations due to security. So maybe that's something we can take a look at a little bit later. And don't guess when it comes to teams, because, if you think you've got some good guidance and, you're not sure about it, whether you're optimized or not, you're going to see wide variability. And variability is a bad thing, because, 1 minute your users could be getting a good experience and the next they may not, because a few people decided to use their cameras. So definitely be careful with that. And doing my research, I also found another tool. I didn't use it in this research, but I could see how it would be very helpful. It's called the Network Testing Companion by Microsoft. It's a little PowerShell utility, or a little installable, that when you run it, it's more of a command line type of tool, and it will give you a lot of important information on your team's environment and how it looks on the network. So definitely encourage you to check that out if you're looking for some more details about your environment. Now, if you want to get started doing some of the things that I've been doing here to benefit your organization, again, it's not just about testing, but it's also about cost. We have a virtual appliance for Azure where you can deploy it into Azure and take advantage of it right away, anywhere in the world. As you've seen, I can use it to test teams. You can use it to test teams. If you're looking at things like autoscale in AVD, using Citrix or VMware or Nerdio or any of these things, you definitely can learn a lot about how that works by sending a workflow or a virtual user workload at it with Login Enterprise. And then FSLogix is another area. Maybe it impacts your logon durations or things like that. If I want to see how FSLogix behaves in a massively scaled operation, again, you can use Login Enterprise to do that. So I would encourage you to request a one-on-one demo where we can kind of show you these things. You could discover them for yourselves, and maybe even get a trial going where you can play around like I have. So, my intention was to keep this pretty quick to around 30 minutes, and I think we're pretty much there, just a little bit over that. So I want to thank you for joining me today during this webinar. If you're doing the replay again, thanks so much for using the information that I've been able to provide for you. I would love to be able to help you in your own organizations if you want to do something like this. So please reach out to us. You can hit us up at info@loginvsi.com. Hit me up at b.parkhill@loginvsi.com, or just hit our website. We're here to help, and we want to make sure that you get the best cost out of the solution that you're using. And if you're moving to the cloud and moving from a capital to more of an operating expense, you're going to have to really figure out, what that looks like, because you're endeavoring into a whole new world with the cloud versus on-prem. So we're here to help. We'll get you that information quickly. Thanks again for joining, and please take care.